Dealey Plaza is not some random place. All the major thoroughfares and highways in the city essentially meet within that vicinity of that plaza. You really can't go anywhere in the city without having to turn your head at some point and say, wow, that's where Kennedy was killed.
Dallas is really such a beautiful city, and it's really a friendly, outgoing, open sort of city. It always has been. That really cast a shadow.
It looked as though the entire city had turned out.
Something that is so ingrained in the average American's memory. We've seen this image so many times in the movies and on television of Kennedy driving through Dealey Plaza.
I can remember it just as if it's a newsreel running out in front of me.
And then the crack of two rifle shots. I think, did somebody just fire a shot at the president?
I didn't see any movement at all. I didn't have a stethoscope with me, but I couldn't feel any pulses.
We've had reports of 3 shots being fired at the motorcade in downtown Dallas, with reports that both Kennedy and Connie had been hit.
The president was indeed dead, at which time I felt much more like weeping than talking.
I think that event changed the way we look at everything.
It was the weekend that America lost its innocence.
How could any one person do that to the president, and how could he do that to the city of Dallas and to Texas?
Welcome to the Inside Story. I'm VOA Midwest correspondent Kane Fairbaugh. The events that occurred here in Dallas, Texas in November of 1963 are some of the most analyzed and controversial moments in American history. For those who were here in Texas to witness the tragedy unfold firsthand, it was an event seared into their collective memory. Several of the interviews in this program are with eyewitnesses who are no longer with us. As the event recedes further into history, their memories of those fateful days here in Texas and how it shaped the rest of their lives and our own national identity are now preserved. We share those memories in this program to help us all remember and better understand the impact of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy.
Friday morning, 11 o'clock. The presidential jet leaves Fort Worth for the short flight to Dallas, where the president has a scheduled luncheon address.
I was a registered nurse here at Parkland Hospital, and on that day I was working in the outpatient clinic department. Something started to come into view here on the right side, and so as I turned my head, it was the president's airplane. It was close enough, it was within 2 blocks of the hospital, and I could see the presidential seal on the side.
Several thousand enthusiastic Texans are on hand to give the president and Mrs. Kennedy a warm welcome.
I showed up and was gratified to see that it looked as though the entire city had turned out.
The usual welcoming committee presents Mrs. Kennedy with a bouquet of red roses.
There were some local conservatives and Texas conservatives in general who had developed quite an antipathy to the Kennedys.
We knew that there had been some problems in Dallas previous to this trip, and so it was considered it could be some problems that developed, but we had no threats, no information that would lead us to believe that it was going to be a major problem.
Although the president is running behind schedule, he pauses momentarily to shake a few hands.
With President Kennedy was mix and mingle. He didn't like anybody to come between he and the people.
Friday, 10 minutes before noon, the motorcade begins the 11-mile ride to the Dallas Trade Mart, where the president is to deliver a major address. Governor and Mrs. Connally ride in the presidential limousine.
As I no more looked at the crowd, here came a car through it with flags on the fenders, and then I remembered reading in the paper that President Kennedy was going to be in town that day. Traffic stopped in front of me, and I sat there for a moment and got out of my car to walk 3 or 4 steps to get out from under the triple underpass, see what was going on.
The president's car is now turning onto Elm Street, and it will be only a matter of minutes before he arrives at the Trade Mart. I was on Simmons Freeway earlier, and even the freeway was jam-packed with spectators waiting their chance to see the president as he made his way toward the Trade Mart.
I can remember it just as if it's a newsreel running out in front of me. I was scanning to the left, looking at the very sparse crowd on the left in this rather open area, just a grassy area. And I heard an explosive noise to my right rear.
I no more than see the president's car, and a couple seconds later, somebody throws a firecracker. I thought. Turns out it was the first shot.
I saw the president grab at his throat and move to his left. I knew something was wrong.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route.
They tell me there was a second shot while I was running. I didn't hear it.
Something stung me in the face during the 2 rifle shots. And I'm standing there dumbfounded trying to figure out what had happened. I think, did somebody just fire a shot at the president?
Third shot had been fired, hit the president in the head, caused a massive wound which caused blood and brains and bone material to be exploded out onto the car, onto me, onto Mrs. Kennedy. I proceeded to get up on the car. About that time, Mrs. Kennedy came up on the trunk. She was trying to retrieve some material that came off the president's head and went to the right rear. I grabbed her and did the best I could to get her back in the seat. When I did that, the president fell to his left into her lap. I got up on top and lay on top behind both of them. See this gaping hole in the president's upper right rear of his head. His eyes were fixed. It appeared to me there had been a fatal wound. And I turned and gave a thumbs down to the follow-up car.
There was no mistaking what it was. There were 3 shots.
Several police officers are rushing up the hill at this time. Stand by just a moment, please. Something has happened in the motorcade route. Stand by, please.
By the time the 3rd shot was fired, I was running across Houston Street trying to find out what happened. And there were 2 people laying over here on the ground. As I came around, I said, there's 2 dead ones to myself. But as I got closer around and closer to them, they started to get up.
There has been a shooting. Parkland Hospital has been advised to stand by for a severe gunshot wound.
The supervisor came hurrying from her office. She said, there's been an accident in the president's motorcade.
We know it's the presidential car. You can see Mrs. Kennedy's pink suit. There's a Secret Service man, spread eagle, over the top of the car. We understand Governor and Mrs. Connolly are in the car with President and Mrs. Kennedy.
And the doors just exploded open. I didn't have time to think what was going on. Then came the president's carriage. Jackie was leaning over his head and shoulders. In fact, her feet were up off the floor and her hands were across him, holding on to the railing on his left side. And there was a huge exit wound right below his Adam's apple. I didn't have a stethoscope with me, but I couldn't feel any pulses.
And just now we've received reports here at Parkland that Governor Connolly was shot in the upper left chest, and the first unconfirmed reports say the president was hit in the head.
The dignitaries who had been in the motorcade were just milling around in shock. The conversations were quiet, subdued, uncertain.
And we did not know if the president was alive or dead when we entered the hospital. And almost the first thing we saw was just a wave of nurses coming down the hallway and crying hysterically. And we knew immediately the president was dead.
As the time went on, the word obviously spread through the crowd, and there were more tears. And I would have been crying too if I had had leave to do so. Instead, I had to save my tears and just broadcast what I saw.
So we're now going to switch you to Sid Davis at the hospital in Dallas.
Jim, we have just had the official word from Malcolm Kilduff, the Associate Presidential Press Secretary, that President Kennedy is dead.
As the press corps covering the rapidly changing events in Dallas tried feverishly to provide the public with accurate information, reporter Sid Davis with the Westinghouse Broadcasting Company had an up-close view to an iconic American moment. VOA national correspondent Steve Herman met with Davis to talk about his role in an event immortalized in a photograph.
How did you end up getting from Parkland Hospital out back to Love Field?
From the hospital, a guy named Jiggs Falver, a White House press office transportation person, said, "You're going to be a puller. You've got to get out of here. The president wants to put this on the air. You've got to get out of here. There's a police car waiting for you outside." We went through the streets of Dallas, in and out of traffic, racing for Love Field. They didn't want Air Force One to leave without us. And we got to Love Field. Air Force One was gearing up. I boarded the airplane.
At that point, did you know what was going to happen next?
I followed Lyndon Johnson around the airplane as he met with staff. He held meetings right in the immediacy of Kennedy's death. He's holding meetings talking about what we're going to do. He picks up the phone. He calls Bobby Kennedy, the president's brother, and says, I think we have to go back to Washington. Mrs. Kennedy agreed. She did not want the body to remain in Dallas because it would have meant an autopsy, a delay. She didn't want that to happen.
Why do you think Johnson wanted to immediately take the oath in Dallas and not do a ceremony back in the White House?
He saw the problems of going back to Washington, that would take 3 or 4 hours. Then there were members of Congress would get involved and say, we're going to have a ceremony. We're going to do this or do that. And Johnson didn't want that. Mrs. Kennedy didn't. They wanted to have the swearing in. The only way to do that was to do it in Dallas. And it was decided to do it that way. LBJ made that decision. I heard him say, we're going to take the oath here.
Johnson insists that Mrs. Kennedy, in her blood-stained dress, stands next to him.
He arranged the photograph.
Why did he want her in the photograph with her blood-stained dress right next to him when he's being sworn in?
I don't think the blood-stained dress bothered him. He wanted her in the picture. He called her, he put his arm on her shoulder, and he called her, at one point he called her, darling, you stand here. Mrs. Johnson stands here. He knew she had to be in that picture. What she was thinking was, I've lost my husband. But she was willing to do all of the things Johnson was telling her to do. My judgment is she wanted to be in the picture.
You had to wait for Kennedy's body to arrive, to be loaded into the plane. But Johnson wants to fly back immediately. You were asked to stay on the plane and fly back to Washington, but you did not. Why?
No, I volunteered to get off and give the pool report. There were 40-some White House correspondents. And since I was the only pooler in that little group, I volunteered to stay there and give the pool report to the rest of the White House correspondents.
The swearing-in ceremony took place in the presidential suite of Air Force One, the large Boeing 707 fan jet that brought the president to Dallas today.
When did it hit you about the enormity of what you had witnessed that day?
The White House correspondents have a reputation for the bottle. And going back to Washington that night, about 11 p.m., not a single one of the 50 reporters had a drink. The most unusual thing. The stewardesses turned out the lights and brought pillows so that we could sleep. We arrived in Washington about 4:30 a.m. And I went immediately to Andrews Air Force Base to see what was going on and began preparations for the morning broadcast. And I saw Mrs. Kennedy arrive at the airport, sitting with the casket in the limousine. Sitting beside that, she had her hand on the casket. I could see the red dress and the sadness of what had taken place that day. And I wrote my first story that way. I went on the air, and I quoted the words of Robert Frost. I said, the woods are lovely, dark and deep.
I have promises to keep and many miles to go before I sleep. And with that, this is Sid Davis reporting from the White House.
For many in 1963, word of the assassination of President Kennedy reached them by television, a relatively new and unproven medium for news coverage. The events in Dallas, as reported by those covering the tragedy, became a case study that guided news organizations in how they reported on all the major situations that followed.
I worked at KRLD, AM, FM, and TV, also associated with the Dallas Times-Herald.
When radio reporter Bob Huffaker set out to cover President Kennedy's motorcade in Dallas, it marked a new shift in the way his organization was covering a live news event.
Up until then, I'd done radio broadcasts from many scenes, but that was the first day we actually marshaled our television mobile facilities.
Newspapers, with daily editions in the morning and evening, were still popular sources of news and information. recalls former Fort Worth Star-Telegram reporter Bob Schieffer.
They didn't just quite didn't believe it until they saw it in the paper, and then that kind of made it sort of official. And from that weekend on, of course, it would be television would be the place where most people got their news.
What was on television during a 4-day ordeal from the time Kennedy was shot to his funeral in Washington was a mixture of fact, speculation, and unfiltered drama, as millions of people watched events such as the killing of suspected assassin Lee Harvey Oswald unfold on live television. Through much of that coverage, Huffaker says he tried to be calm in a storm of unfolding events amid a sea of misinformation.
We were concentrating during all of this time on reporting things as calmly as possible.
In the resulting coverage, a steady stream of facts about the suspected assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, came through Huffaker's competition, KLIF radio news reporter Gary DeLon, who had a well-placed source inside the Dallas Police Department.
And he'd say, "You didn't get it from me. You're a liar if you ever mention my name." But he would go like this, and I'd walk down the hall for coffee or something and say, "Okay, this is a story." And I knew this stuff before it ever made it publicly, and they were all factual.
What they discovered that it was not an altogether dignified process. People pushed and shoved and shouted, and there was a lot of back and forth, and I think it caused people to wonder about all this.
But Schieffer adds it was the first time the American public saw that process, and since then, the demand for more information sooner has only increased.
It was the weekend that America lost its innocence, and the country has never been the same since that weekend in Dallas.
The assassination of President John F. Kennedy shook the nation and the Secret Service. The car the president was traveling in that day in Dallas is now on display for everyone to see here at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. Agent Clint Hill would go on to protect 3 more presidents, but overcome by depression, largely because he felt he didn't get on the back of this car a second sooner, he retired from the Secret Service in 1975. He rarely spoke about what happened that day in Dallas, but in 2009, author Lisa McCubbin requested an interview for a potential book.
He'd done one interview in 1975 with 60 Minutes. That's a classic interview in which he had basically a nervous breakdown on television. And from then, he went into seclusion.
But eventually, Hill and other agents decided to talk, in part to document how the assassination affected them. Hill, McCubbin, and former agent Gerald Blaine collaborated on several books. Hill says the release of the books has been therapeutic.
Especially being able to go out and talk to the people about the book, answer a lot of the questions that they have, because there are still a lot of questions out there. There's no question that we've failed in providing protection for President Kennedy.
Agent Gerald Blaine was also in Texas that day, but not in Dallas. He says a lack of manpower was partly responsible.
In 1963, we had 330 agents. We had about 34 agents on the White House detail.
The agents were visible, but Blaine says they couldn't communicate with each other.
We didn't have radios. We operated through hand signals. We had to rely on each other to work together as a team.
Author Lisa McCubbin collaborated with Blaine on the book The Kennedy Detail. She says weaknesses exposed by the Kennedy assassination forced a change in how the Secret Service was funded.
So it made them realize, I think, even more how important their mission was. And they were able then to convince Congress to get more money. They had been asking for more money for years and years to get more people. They knew they couldn't protect the president with what they had.
Agent Clint Hill stayed with the Secret Service after the assassination. He rose to the rank of assistant director and witnessed dramatic changes in the way the agency conducted presidential protection. One of the most important, no more travel in open automobiles like the one President Kennedy was in that day in Dallas.
Everything has changed, and yet the agents today are no different than the agents were in 1963.
But several months after Hill retired from the Secret Service in 1975, despite the increased protection, not once but twice assailants tried to kill President Gerald Ford during separate visits to California. And in 1981, another disaster narrowly averted. President Ronald Reagan, emerging from a Washington hotel, was shot by John Hinckley Jr. Mr. Reagan was rushed to a nearby hospital for life-saving surgery. Secret Service agent Tim McCarthy was shot in the abdomen. Press Secretary James Brady was struck in the head and seriously disabled. But no one died in the attack, and McCarthy says the incident led to even more changes.
After that, metal detectors were used to screen anyone who gets near the president shortly thereafter. And the legacy is that since that time, there has not been another attack on any of our presidents by the historic assassin, which is the lone gunman.
There's no such thing as 100% protection. There's always something that develops. So I always said, you never know what's around that next corner.
President Kennedy's assassination in Dallas, Texas, put the building behind me, the Texas School Book Depository, on the map of history. Despite several efforts to tear the structure down, the old warehouse is now both a museum and a tribute to President Kennedy's legacy.
I do know that it was a real contentious issue for a long time, what to do with this site.
History professor Jeffrey Engel of Southern Methodist University in Dallas says community leaders long struggled to balance the reality of the assassination with the way it negatively impacted the city.
The Kennedy assassination confirmed the identity of Dallas in American minds. Dallas was a place that was known at the time as a hateful, dark city in many ways on a national scene in terms of politics.
So when Kennedy was killed here in Dallas, there was this kind of collective, oh, Dallas, that's where things like this happen. Dallas is a toxic environment where extremism can thrive. It was an unfair characterization, but it lingered as a dark cloud over this community for decades.
Stephen Fagan is the curator of the 6th Floor Museum, which now occupies the 6th floor of the former Texas School Book Depository, where investigators say Lee Harvey Oswald fired at President Kennedy's motorcade.
We are a historical institution that explores the life, death, and legacy of President Kennedy and the broader history and culture of the 1960s.
The 6th Floor Museum, situated at the edge of Dealey Plaza, opened in 1989 and quickly became a top tourist destination.
Dealey Plaza is the second most visited tourist attraction in the state of Texas, right after the Alamo.
There are sites in this country that are stained by violence and tragedy. Dealey Plaza is one of those, much like Pearl Harbor or the footprint of the World Trade Center. And sites like this allow us to do justice to a tragic event by remembering it properly.
Fagan says remembering it properly does not mean the 6th Floor Museum draws definitive conclusions about exactly what happened in Dallas in November of 1963.
Well, the assassination, like so many other things, it's a very divisive topic. People typically arrive here knowing whether they believe Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone or whether there was a conspiracy.
The Kennedy conspiracy theorists still hold a grip on the nation's psyche in some ways, that you can go to Dealey Plaza and tell yourself, I've heard the story, maybe I can piece it together a little bit myself now differently because I've seen it with my own eyes.
You may be intrigued by the nuances of the assassination, the lingering questions surrounding bullet trajectories and medical evidence, but at the end of the day, something died here, and Dealey Plaza sort of stands for that unfulfilled hope and promise that John F. Kennedy represented.
The 6th Floor Museum is not just a series of exhibits for visitors to walk through. It is also a repository and archive. Some of the film footage of the moments during the assassination are preserved and licensed by the museum, as are recordings of oral histories of eyewitnesses and key figures in the events. Collectively, they fill the 6th Floor Museum with more than just physical artifacts that help put a watershed moment of the 20th century into perspective historically and locally.
Certainly, I think Dallas has tried to come to terms with the dark moment in its past and internalize the assassination in many ways. And where we're standing, this museum, I think, has played a very key role in helping this community kind of exorcise the last remaining demons from 1963.
Thanks for joining us on The Inside Story. You can connect with us on Facebook and Instagram at VOA News. You can also visit our website at any time at voanews.com. Be sure to catch up on past episodes of The Inside Story also on our free streaming service, VOA+. I'm Kane Fairbaugh, and we'll see you next week on The Inside Story.